Hello, I'm David Beckworth, and this is part two of a presentation on the Fed's Framework Review. As many of you know, the Framework Review begins at the January 2025 FOMC meeting. And in the first installment of this presentation, I looked at inflation lessons learned. We saw that the public really dislikes inflation. We saw there's threshold effects of the public's attention paid to inflation. And finally, we see that there are scarring effects for the public to inflation. And all these have implications for the framework review itself. In this presentation, we're going to look at framework lessons learned. So, as many of you also know, the Federal Reserve introduced FAIT, Flexible Average Inflation Targeting, in 2020, which was a step up from Flexible Inflation Targeting, FIT. So we went from FIT to FAIT. We're going to talk about that and lessons learned from its use over this time. Now let's go back and look at flexible inflation targeting, or FIT, in the United States. In 2012, the Federal Reserve officially adopts its 2% inflation target and spells it out in its Statement on Longer Run Goals and Monetary Policy Strategy. This document is also called the Consensus Statement, and in it, it has not only the 2% inflation target on PCE inflation, it also has the Fed's response to deviations of employment from maximum employment. It has both parts of the Fed's dual mandate, and therefore the Fed in this statement effectively was adopting a flexible inflation target. And this can be described by something like a Taylor rule. This blue equation here shows a standard Taylor rule, and it says that the interest rate that the central bank targets should be set equal to, first, the neutral nominal rate plus the inflation gap, and that's the difference between the inflation target and the actual observed inflation rate in the current period, plus an output gap term. And this is the difference between actual real GDP and potential real GDP. This term can also be specified in terms of an unemployment or an employment gap. The Federal Reserve used its flexible inflation target from 2012 up through 2020. In that year, it adopted a flexible average inflation target, or FAIT. The motivation for FAIT was to be able to deal with zero lower bound environments where interest rates were low, where inflation was low, and the Fed worried it would not have much room to cut interest rates. So FAIT incorporated two big changes. Number one, it added makeup policy. That is, when the Fed would miss its inflation target from below. So if it was running below 2%, in subsequent periods, it would run inflation higher than 2%. So its inflation target became more flexible in the short run, with the goal in mind that on average, the average component here to FAIT would cause inflation to go to 2%. The other big change in FAIT is that it took deviations from maximum employment and replaced that with shortfalls. It would now only respond to shortfalls from maximum employment. In terms of a reaction function, it looks something like this. The Fed now responds to an inflation gap where FAIT is the target in that bracket. And now the output gap has a minimization problem where the Fed only responds to shortfalls in the output gap, or negative output gaps. Now, of course, this again could be framed in terms of the labor market. So that first term represents makeup of policy from below 2%, and that last term is shortfalls from maximum employment. In plain English, the Federal Reserve can only respond to negative values in the output gap, or it can only respond to shortfalls from maximum employment. Another way to think about FAIT is to view it as a version of temporary price level targeting, an idea first introduced by Ben Bernanke in 2017. Rich Clarida, who was vice chair during the adoption of FAIT, made this connection several times in his speeches. On January 13, 2021, he noted that I believe that a useful way to summarize the framework is temporary price level targeting that reverts to flexible inflation targeting once the conditions for left-off have been reached. So he viewed FAIT as a form of temporary price level targeting as long as the conditions were appropriate. Now, FAIT was announced by Chair Powell in August 2020, and it is still in the consensus statement, so officially it's still a part of the document, but its actual runtime went through March 2022, so it lasted just over a year and a half. Nonetheless, a number of economists and Observers have gone back and evaluated it and have come up with some improvements, some suggestions. And I've looked at a number of studies that have done this and compiled a list, a consensus list of sorts, as I see it anyhow. And I want to go through that list with you. How could FAIT be improved, changed? What parts could be kept? What parts tossed out? The first thing was the framework should be robust to various scenarios. So as it currently is set up, FAIT is designed for a zero lower bound environment. Fed officials themselves have noted this. Governor Chris Waller at a recent conference made this point. But a number of studies have looked at this carefully and come to this conclusion. For example, Gotti Ergensen and Don Cohn, I mentioned them earlier, in their 2023 paper, they note the 2020 framework implied an inflation bias. It was crafted for dealing with the last challenge the Federal Reserve faced. Yet every new challenge policymakers face is rarely the same as the last one. Any policy framework should be robust to a broad range of scenarios. In short, they're saying don't fight the last war. Have a framework that can fight any war. Romer and Romer had something similar to say. They noted that the framework was designed to fit a particular set of circumstances: inflation persistently below target, a flat Phillips curve, and heightened concerns about job opportunities in historically disadvantaged communities that do not capture the range of situations the Federal Reserve may face or conditions the monetary policy can affect. Our findings imply that the framework review should seek to revise the strategy to be more general and flexible. Now, they are speaking to another change that was added, and for them, this is also consequential, and that is a redefinition of maximum employment to be broad and inclusive. The second suggested improvement or ideal characteristic for the framework is that it should be symmetric. Michael Kiley, for example, in a paper presented at Brookings, noted that an asymmetric monetary policy has unintended consequences, including exacerbating activity shortfalls and creating an inflationary bias. He notes the irony is that by only responding to shortfalls and trying to really help shortfalls, you can actually make shortfalls worse. You exacerbate the business cycle. Bill English and Brian Sachs said something similar. They noted that we would drop the indication that policy depends on shortfalls. It seems unwise for the committee to restrict its ability to be preemptive. Here, they're arguing that if you only respond to shortfalls, you're not allowing yourself to respond to signals from the labor market that might tell you inflation is going to take off. It prevents you from doing preemptive tightening of policy via the Phillips curve because you're not allowed to look at overshoots of maximum employment. You can only look at shortfalls. So between not being able to be preemptive and also exacerbating the business cycle, get rid of shortfalls and make it deviations from maximum employment that matter, not just shortfalls. So return to what we had before 2020 with regards to maximum employment. Another part, however, to the symmetric part is the weighting of the dual mandate. So Gotti Ergensen and Don Cohn noted that the 2020 framework elevated the maximum employment goal and implied inflation bias. Romer and Romer, Christy Romer and David Romer, noted something similar. They said, it's hard to see a case where requiring that one side of the dual mandate be fully achieved before attention is paid to the other. The FOMC should follow a balanced approach in promoting them. So this again goes back to something we noted in the first presentation. We need to put equal weighting on both sides of the mandate. And the way FAIT is currently set up, it puts more weight on maximum employment. The third suggestion or framework lesson learned is that the framework should see through supply shocks. Now, this is standard fare for central banks, particularly in advanced economies. Look through supply shocks. Don't respond to them if they're temporary and idiosyncratic. Now, Chair Powell actually responded to this in a speech that he gave at the end of 2023. And he noted several things. First, he recounted the standard understanding of this approach. He says, for many years, it's been generally thought that monetary policy should limit its response to, or quote, look through supply shocks. And then he goes on to say, our experience since 2020 highlights some limits of that thinking. He's saying in practice is a little bit trickier than what's put on paper. Number one, to begin with, it can be challenging to disentangle supply shocks from demand shocks in real time. So the Fed ideally responds to inflation caused by demand and looks through inflation caused by supply shocks. But how do you know in real time? That proves really tricky. Secondly, his concern was that supply shocks that drive inflation high enough for long enough can affect long-term inflation expectations. And this goes back to a point made by Oliver FAIT on the threshold effect that we saw in the previous presentation. He noted back there that if we get to 4%, households begin to pay a lot more attention to inflation, even though it's caused by supply shocks. And so Chair Powell's concern is, look, if you have severe enough, persistent enough supply shocks, it can actually lead to an anchoring of inflation expectations. Maybe you can't always look through them. So this leads us to the next point, that if you are wanting to look through supply shocks, you need to have a credible nominal anchor. Points 3 and 4 go together hand in hand. Look through temporary idiosyncratic supply shocks, but do so with a credible nominal anchor so that inflation expectations remain anchor. The fifth framework lesson learned and suggestion for the framework review is that the framework should continue to do make-up policy. There are concerns that we might go back to zero lower bound in the future. And so you don't want to give it up. You don't want to throw the baby out the bathwater just because we had a bout of high inflation. Keep the powder dry, so to speak, for zero lower bound environments. So again, Michael Kiley had something to say about this. He argued that a broad set of make-up policy strategies ensure good economic performance. He also notes that it's likely in the next recession will cut all the way down to zero and be back to the zero lower bound. Christine David Bromark said something similar. They think it's important that the framework maintain make-up policy, because we never know what we're going to endure in the next period. I would also note here, it's probably useful to have symmetric make-up policy, although you probably don't want to have symmetric price level targeting. I'm going to suggest an alternative, symmetric nominal GDP level targeting, that avoids some of the problems with it when we get to the next presentation. But for now, the key insight is these authors and others have suggested maintaining make-up policy. All right, number 6 is that the framework should be easy to communicate. And a number of commentators observed this wasn't the case with FAIT. Again, Gotti Ergensen, Don Cohn had this to say: leaving moderately and for some time undefined was essential for flexibility, but judging from press and conference questions and commentary, the one-sided nature of the averaging was not well understood, and the lack of definition left observers uncertain. Mickey Levy and Charlie Plosser said something similar. The FAIT's lack of numeric guidelines for its makeup strategy added confusion and uncertainty about the Fed's intermediate goals. So there's a lot of uncertainty about FAIT and what it meant, and it needed to be communicated clearly. When you have shortfalls, when you got asymmetry both on the inflation target and on the maximum employment side, it really is tough to communicate clearly. So you need a framework that can do that successfully. Finally, the last point is that the framework should enhance financial stability. So again, points 1 through 7, the framework should be robust to a variety of scenarios. The framework should be symmetric. The framework should see through supply shocks. The framework should have a credible nominal anchor. It should include make-up policy, be easy to communicate, and should enhance financial stability. Well, that is quite a list. And the question is there a framework that can do it all? John Cochran at a conference where they had a panel that looked at this. He was a moderator. He wrote this in response to that. He said, I realized, wow, what we need in a new strategy to replace FAIT is getting mighty complicated. Distinguishing supply from demand shocks, from fiscal shocks, dealing with crisis, zero bound versus regular policy, changes in the financial system, fiscal and financial dominance, needing to think about contingencies, not forecasts, stress testing monetary policy. How do you write this all down? John Cochran is right. That is a tall order to come up with a framework that can do it all. This picture of Jay Powell here looking perplexed is on point. How do you come up with a framework that can do the 7 items I came up with or the items that John Cochran listed? It can be a daunting task. And in fact, in November of 2024, Chair Powell sat down with a reporter, Captain Rampel, and he had this to say. Listen carefully.
The base case should be more like a traditional reaction function where you don't promise an overshoot, you just target inflation. We haven't made any decisions, but those are the questions we'll be asking.
That is remarkable. Chair Powell says his base case is a reaction function that does not promise to overshoot. In other words, a reaction function or a framework that does not include makeup policy. The 2020 FAIT framework was a big change. I dare say a sea change in how central banks do monetary policy. It incorporates makeup policy, something that has been talked about for decades in the literature. So this would be a big change to go that direction and then abandon FAIT to go back to FIT. But I'm here to tell you there is a way out. There is a way to maintain makeup policy. There's a way to do the 7 items that I have prescribed. And in the next video segment, when we talk about monetary policy implications, I will make the case there is something the Federal Reserve can do. There is still hope to do it all. So come back to that. We'll see you next time.